Hey everybody, and welcome back to a special edition of profiles from the Titanic. Every once in a while when I find something pretty interesting, hopefully you will too, I'll do a special video on it as a special profile. And today, as you notice by the little thumbnail for this video, it's going to be one of the most iconic photographs ever taken on board the Titanic. And so that's why this is going to be a special photo profile of the Titanic. And let's go ahead and put that picture up right now. It's just going to be us talking about it and taking a look at this very iconic photograph. All right, so this is the photo. You've probably seen it before, and it features the gentleman in the middle watching his young son, and that the man right there he's actually holding a camera. Yeah, that is Frederick Spedden, and that is his 6-year-old son by the name of Robert Douglas Spedden. There's several other people watching him, right? And this was taken on board the Titanic while she was under sail. Now, the first thing you may be wondering is, wait a minute, I thought we don't have any photographs of the Titanic under sail because, well, when she sank, nobody out of any of the survivors apparently did not save their cameras, unfortunately. Think of how many photographs we lost. Especially, for example, in this photo here, you notice that Frederick Spedden in the middle there, he's actually cradling his camera. It's around a strap around his neck. It's on a strap around his neck. And we have eyewitness testimony by his wife, Daisy Spedden, that he had taken a lot of photographs, but unfortunately his camera did not survive. Now, all the Speddens, fortunately for them, they did survive. And getting back to the photo, though, and that big question of, well, wait a minute, how do we have a photo of the Titanic under sail? Well, we have to remember, the Titanic left Southampton on Wednesday, April 10th, 1912. She went over to France, picked up people there at Cherbourg later that afternoon, and then she overnighted to April 11th, Thursday the 11th, where she then docked about midday at Queenstown. Picked up the final passengers there, and in the afternoon on Thursday, April 11th, she set sail for America, and there you go. She was on her maiden voyage. But the interesting thing about that, though, is that there were actually a few people who boarded the Titanic at Southampton, for example, but then disembarked at Queenstown. And one of the people, and in fact, the very photographer who took this photo is this gentleman right here. We'll put that photo up. And he is known commonly today as Father Francis Brown. At the time he was on board the Titanic, however, he was not ordained a priest yet. He was a seminarian. He was in a Jesuit seminary. And his uncle, who was a bishop, bought him a ticket to sail on the Titanic, but only to go from Southampton over to Queenstown. And the story there goes that actually he was quite fortunate because he met a wealthy American couple when he overnighted from April 10th to April 11th. They invited him to come to the United States. They said they would buy his ticket if he would accompany them over, and they would send him back later. And the story goes that he asked his superior if he could go, and the answer came back, get off that ship, get back here. So fortunately for Father Brown, he did disembark. And the other good thing about that, of course, he never went on the ship, so he survived, of course. But the other thing about that is that he was a big-time photographer. And you can look up online about many of his other photos and tens of thousands of photographs that he took throughout his career. It's quite amazing. But he put together a Titanic album, and he took a bunch of photos from the Titanic's departure from Southampton and what life was like on board, at least for those 2 days of sail. And so, believe it or not, there actually were people who successfully sailed on the Titanic. They actually got on and then they got off, and they were okay, right, because they stayed over there. So that's how this photo was taken. This photo was taken, apparently, in the morning on Thursday, April 11th, 1912. You see the very long shadows. So apparently this was kind of early in the morning as the sun was coming up. And as you look at this photograph, Father Brown this is the aft end, so this is near the back end of the superstructure on the I believe it's the A deck promenade, but or maybe even the boat deck. But he's actually right in the middle of the ship, and he's actually turned to starboard. And that's one of the cranes, that big round thing behind the Speddens there and the crane. And so he's looking to the right, off the right side or starboard side of the ship. The bow is to your left, the stern and the poop deck is to the right. And there you see Frederick Spedden watching his young 6-year-old son, Robert Douglas Spedden, an elderly gentleman there on the left looking. And there's actually a couple of people here on the right, a gentleman with his back to us, and a lot of people don't really realize this, but there's actually a woman in front of him on the right side. You can see her shadow, and you can actually see her long skirt right there in front of him. And so these are the Speddens. Now, what happened to them, and what's going on with them? Well, actually, Frederick Spedden, his wife Daisy, they had two maids and assistants, a nanny and a maid, along with them, and they were coming back from their vacation, and so they were on board here when Father Brown took this photograph. But what ended up happening is on the night of April 14th, when the Titanic struck the iceberg, actually they were one of the very earliest families. They got dressed, they got up to the boat deck, and this was at about 12:45 or 12:50. Now, as you know, this was pretty early on. The first lifeboat, the first of the lifeboats to hit the water were on the front starboard side. Lifeboats 5 and 7 were the very first ones launched at about 12:45 and 12:50. And the Speddens got to lifeboat number 3, which was pretty much the next one to be launched, and it launched at 12:55. And that's very, very early in the sinking, because this was barely an hour to go. Remember, Captain Smith had just been notified pretty much by Thomas Andrews at about 12:25 or so. So this was barely half hour after they realized the damage and that the Titanic was in trouble. So they were very fortunate. And in fact, if you really think about it, the Speddens and those people in those lifeboats especially, they didn't really have any kind of trauma getting off the ship. They basically got up there, they got in the boats, they were barely half full, and they launched, and that was the end of it. They were out there floating around. No big deal to them, in a way. And so their boat, lifeboat number 3, launched at about 12:55. All of them got in. Remember, at the early part of the evacuation, this was on the side where First Officer Murdoch was, and so after all the women and children got in, there was no one else around except for men, so he let them get in. There was some 10 or so stokers. Frederick Spedden got in, and they estimated that ultimately about 38 to 40 people got into that lifeboat, which of course still would have held up to 65, so even then it was only about 2/3 filled. But they were eventually rescued by the Carpathia, and they made it back home, right? And so there you go. Now, one other interesting thing about this photograph is that it's so iconic that this little scene here was actually included in part of James Cameron's Titanic movie. You may remember the scene. Jack Dawson climbs over the rail back there. You can see the rail back there behind little Douglas Spedden. You see him climbing over the rail, and then as you see the Titanic deck chair behind over there, you see that there's things draped on it. And in the movie, Jack picks up one of those things. It's a coat, and that's the one that he apparently stole later on, that we find out, right? And that's the scene where he does that. But there actually is a bit of a controversy about that scene, in the fact that in the movie, that scene was placed after the church service, if you kind of watch it very closely, which was on Sunday, April 14th. Now, as we have just discussed, right, we know that this photo was not taken on Sunday the 14th. It was taken by Father Brown on Thursday, April 11th. So there is a little bit of a discrepancy there, unless the Speddens got out there and played with the top every morning. That's the only way I guess you could justify that. But in any case, that was a little difference right there. But again, the actual photo was taken in the late morning on Thursday, April 11th. Now, what ultimately happened to the Speddens? Well, Little Robert Douglas. We mentioned he was 6 years old. You know, sometimes we think that all the survivors they had, like I said, not a traumatic experience. They just got in the lifeboats and they left very early, right? Well, sometimes they don't live happily ever after, right? And unfortunately, there is a tragic story related to this photograph. Even though the Speddens did survive the sinking of the Titanic, what ended up happening is in August of 1915, just 3 years later, when the family was vacationing in Maine, which they had a second house up there, little Robert Douglas, apparently the story goes that he chased a ball out into the street and he was struck by an automobile and he died a few days later. So yeah, very, very tragic story. He was only 9 years old, so unfortunately, you know, he survives one of the greatest tragedies of all time, only to be struck and killed by a car 3 years later. And apparently it was one of the first automobile fatalities in the state of Maine. Again, this was 1915, so the cars, you know, were pretty early on in the automobile age, right? And unfortunately, that's what happens. That's what happened to young Robert Douglas. Now, the story also continues. Later on, Frederick, right? They go on. He was the only son of the Speddens, but later on, when they're vacationing in Florida, now this was in 1947. Right? So this is, you know, whatever, 35 years afterward. Frederick Spedden is now 80 years old, but he's swimming in a pool, and in February of 1947, he has a heart attack in the pool, and he actually drowns. So, yeah, kind of ironic. Now, he did live a full life. He was 80 years old, but still, those circumstances do make it pretty ironic, don't you? He also survives the Titanic out in the middle of the ocean, but yet he ends up, technically, I guess, drowning and had a heart attack in a pool in 1947. So, those are the circumstances behind this photo, the iconic photo of little Robert Douglas spinning atop on the Titanic. And I hope you enjoyed this special edition of a special photo profile from the Titanic. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.